Hey there, everybody. It's Steve, and I'm joining you from my backyard. A little bit of a change of pace, but I just wanted to keep making. I got a bee in my bonnet to keep doing some video stuff, and so it's dark. And if I walk around, you're probably not going to see me too well anyway. And this isn't the best, but it works. So that being said, it is April 5th, 2021. And that means it's another day, which means another video. But before we get to the fun part of the video, which is the story itself, remember as always to like, share, subscribe, hit up my Patreon, all these little things that help my little channel grow bit by bit each day. The link to my Patreon is in the description below, as well as the links to my Instagram and Facebook pages, closely related to this channel, as well as my other main channel, Steve the Amateur Historian. That all said, the police are out on the prowl. So about a week ago on this channel, I did a kind of interesting video about this discovery in Kirkland, Washington, near Seattle, where a guy stumbled onto the long-abandoned remains of a young man who had been buried in a shallow grave in the hole left behind by an uprooted tree. And in that case, I just kind of looked at, I try not to go beyond the story of that day. So if there's a mystery to what I'm talking about, I try not to go beyond that on this channel, because it's very much about just finding that one moment from that one day. This story that I'm going to bring to you is kind of similar, at least in terms of finding bodies mysteriously. But unlike that video, I actually tried to use some of the information that was in this short article and try to see if I could find any other details about this particular case, and I honestly couldn't find anything. So we are left with this one simple little story that I found. The article, just for sake of geography, for those of you that aren't from Oregon or the Portland area. Now, the article says Oregon City. I really don't know why, because it says that this story... Now, what may have happened is it may have been like the body may have been taken to like a corner in Oregon City and they figured more information out about him. But a body was discovered, and much like the Kirkland, Washington victim, the remains of this person had been left where they were found for clearly a long time. They said that the bones were bleached, meaning like the sun had just been hitting them on and on and on. The clothes that the individual was wearing were practically just, they'd been worn down to just little pieces of like fabric at that point. So this body had been in this area for many, many years, and it was discovered by an employee of the McLean logging company. So, I mean, just that statement alone leads me to believe that, you know, it was because it was an employee who worked there that found these remains. So it was probably in a forested area that the remains were found, and that might explain why they weren't found for as long as they were. But even though the article references Oregon City, you know, at the start, like it was something that happened in Oregon City, it stipulates that the remains were found in Oswego, which was what the town of Lake Oswego used to be known as. And Oregon City and Lake Oswego are not the same area. They're close to each other, but they're firmly established different locations. Oregon City is several miles south of Portland, whereas Lake Oswego borders right up against southwest Portland. And I've been through there many times in my life, and there's several big parks in there. There's Tryon Creek State Park, which is huge. There's another park just north of there. There's a lot of forested area right there where southwest Portland meets Lake Oswego. And there's various other parts of Lake Oswego that are fairly well forested. There's a lot of trees in Lake Oswego, which might be one of the many reasons why it's obscenely expensive to live there. But, of course, you know, it's much more heavily populated than it would have been back at this time. But it totally makes sense that, one, there would be a logging company working out of an area like Lake Oswego, again, formerly just called Oswego. And it also explains, you know, the further likelihood that a body would have been left in this area, and it was probably a heavily forested area that this body was left in that neighborhood. So you have your work cut out for you when you find a body that long after an individual has been dead, and they figured based on the condition of the remains that were recovered, that obviously the body had been in that area for several years. It could have been as long as 10 years, which is wild when you think about it, especially since it seems like all the remains were still in that one area. No animal came along and took anything. Nobody else. I mean, I obviously can't say the exact location where they were found and how rough the conditions may have been getting to that area, which might explain why nobody else would have gone there. But I mean, the employee of the logging company who found the remains, the reason he was where he was when he found those remains was he simply said that he was trying to get back. He was trying to get from point A to point B, and he decided to take a shortcut through this particular area of woods. And in taking that shortcut, he stumbled onto these remains. So the fact that he was picking and choosing this particular area as a shortcut leads me to believe it couldn't have been that difficult to get to. But whatever the circumstances, these remains sat here in the forest of Lake Oswego for probably nigh on to a decade, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit longer. You know, I theorized with the Kirkland, Washington victim. They said it was a young man, but he was dressed really nice. So I figured, you know, it could have been, you know, a robbery. Here was a guy that looked like he had a lot of money, and he could have been robbed, and it could have gone wrong. Well, in this situation, this body that was found, you know, while the clothes were, you know, everything was kind of decomposing, it was noted that this guy had a really nice watch on him that had the initials PP on it, which might have helped lead to his identity being established. Again, I tried to find more information on this case, perusing old newspaper articles at that time, and I really couldn't find anything. I'm sure if I searched really long and hard and really stretched to try to, I might find some other article on it, but I don't even know if that article would definitively explain who this guy was or if they ever actually found out who he was. But in addition to this really nice watch, he had, you know, nice jewelry on him. He had coins. They were like foreign currency. But you know, this stuff wasn't stolen from him. So this guy obviously wasn't, you know, someone who got robbed and then murdered, because if that was the case, the robber would have taken all of these items from him. So it was very interesting. You know, it's hard to say when this body's just been rotting out here for, you know, nearly a decade. It's hard to say exactly how this person came to be dead. The fact that their body was left in such a rural spot, in and of itself, would lead one to think this was, you know, someone was probably trying to get rid of a body, and they put it in an area that they thought it wouldn't be found in. And lo and behold, it was, you know, some 10 years possibly before the body was found. But then what were the circumstances again? So, I mean, obviously you can rule out a robbery. So this must have been, you know, potentially a more, again, if we're looking at this as a murder. Otherwise, you know, maybe this guy was despondent and just went out into the woods and killed himself, or he could have been, you know, walking through there, you know, tripped, fallen, and had an accident. He could have broken something and he couldn't get any help, and he ended up perishing out there. There's a lot of possibilities when you don't really know fully where to start. But if it was a murder, it seems like it would have been something. You know, usually when the items aren't taken off the victim, it's probably more a personal type thing. I don't know. Maybe this victim was fooling around with someone else's wife, and that person found out and took him out. I mean, there's so many directions you can go in a situation like this. Authorities definitely had their work cut out for them, especially being as far back in time as this case was. Like, it would be really hard to fully figure out the identity of this person, much less the ways and whys of how this individual was killed. Now, all that said, there was actually a suggested possible at least something of an identity for this victim. Authorities think they might know who the man was, but it seems like he was kind of a drifter, so I don't know if anybody actually knew the guy's real name. But there just happened to be, several years earlier in the Oswego neighborhood, a guy who was described as a foreigner wandered into town looking for work. And this individual had been hired by a guy named James Irving to do like woodwork, not like, cutting wood, like, making trinkets out of wood, but like actually doing almost kind of, lumber logging type stuff. And then he just disappeared. And when they checked his possessions, they found a bunch of books with the name, I'm pronouncing as Rossiter, Rositor was how it was spelled. So maybe that was the guy's name. How does that tie into the watch that had the initials PP in them? Did either of these apply to the guy's actual name? I mean, that's the biggest problem, is that it seems like even though this guy wandered into Oswego and actually got hired by a family out there to do work, it seems like they still hadn't even ascertained what this guy's identity was, which kind of leaves you hit and miss with things, because I feel like this victim that was found was probably this same guy that wandered into Oswego several years earlier and then suddenly vanished. It doesn't explain how he turned up dead where he was. There was no explanation given. Sorry, there's lots of random noises out here. I feel like someone's going to come and stab me in the back or choke me any second. I'm talking about mystery deaths. Get away from me. But anyway, I feel like there's too many perfect details for it to not be this guy. Now, of course, this guy could have just done some work and then split town. But the fact of the matter is the guy disappeared at the right time. He disappeared randomly several years earlier. He'd been working for a family in Oswego doing, sort of, lumber woodsman type work. And then he, would then randomly end up in a forested area dead, stumbled onto by, of all people, a logger. This guy was described as a foreigner, and it was noticed that he had, foreign coin. The body that was found had foreign coins on it. Just too many things seem to line up. This guy disappeared at the right time from the right area. They even said that, whatever fabric they could get from this body that, that was left with the remains, when it was shown to this people that, of course, this is several years later, you have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt, but they said that the type of, whatever they could get from these clothes kind of matched what they remembered this foreigner wearing. So many things, lined up perfectly in this regard. But even if this guy is this victim that was found, it still, unfortunately, doesn't fully bring us any closer to establishing an identity, because this foreigner from several years before, we still don't know his name. And I just thought it was an interesting, one of these interesting cases of, the mystery body being found in the woods somewhere, and with, again, my efforts to try to find more information not going anywhere. It's we're kind of left in this kind of John Doe situation, and maybe there's answers out there somewhere in another newspaper somewhere, but it would probably take me eons to stumble onto the right article, because I looked up, I used every little piece of information in this article that I could to try to find more information about this. I put down the name of the funeral home the remains were taken to. I put down the name of the logging company that the guy that found the remains worked for. I looked up, like Oswego death, Oswego body, body victim found in Oswego, name Rossiter. The initials PP, which of course that'll get you a lot of results, because that can be anybody's initials or whatever, and none of it got me anywhere. So I'm left in as much mystery in this as the next guy. So maybe there was answers out there. Maybe this guy's identity was firmly established. But I find that when you try to search for this many elements from the story and you can't really find anything, or anything even close to newspapers and resources being released around that same time, a lot of the times it ends up being that victim was just never identified. It's been very rare that, a mystery case like this happens and I can't find any information on it, and then I ultimately later on find out, oh yeah, they did figure out who that person was. So it's unfortunately up in the air, but it's one of these interesting cases of human remains left in, this forested area for nearly a decade, and how even when people try really hard to put human remains somewhere where they think they'll never be found, eventually some human being usually stumbles onto them. You think back to some, one of the most notorious serial killers of all time, which was Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, and he put these bodies way out there in these rural areas, but people found them. You can think you're putting bodies somewhere and no one's ever going to stumble onto them. Somebody's going to eventually stumble onto them in all likelihood. And that happened in this case. But alas, it lingers as a mystery, at least as far as I know. So that is the story for today. I hope you enjoyed me retelling and giving you as many details as I possibly can without there being a full, satisfactory resolution to the whole matter. But it's still interesting. Mystery deaths are always interesting. And how do they die and we don't know? Well, that's both interesting and frustrating. So thank you, as always, for watching and supporting my young channel. Remember, as always, to like, share, subscribe, hit up my Patreon, all those little ways that help a little channel like mine grow a little bit. And I'm always posting new stuff on my Patreon to give you bang for your buck, benefit for you, payback for you for helping me. And the link to my Patreon description is in the description below, as well as the links to my Instagram and Facebook pages closely related to the content that I am producing both for this channel as well as my main channel, Steve the Amateur Historian. If you haven't subscribed to that channel yet, get off your keister and do it. Please. And all that said, this is Steve, and I'll see you tomorrow.